It's a question I get all the time. Are threats useful in negotiation? You know, from our earliest days, most of us have been subject to threats in negotiation. I certainly remember them. It's like my parents saying, Bobby, you have to the count of 3 to get to the bathroom and start getting ready for bed. Otherwise, no dessert for a week. Oh my gosh. Right. Or alternately, if this class doesn't quiet down right now, recess will be canceled and we will sit here in silence the entire time instead. Now, in most cases, I largely remember that these threats worked. I would quickly run to brush my teeth, or a hush would fall over the entire class. But in a larger sense, the question of the utility of threats in negotiation is an open one. And today, I'm going to discuss whether threats in negotiation are a good idea. And I'm going to offer 3 key questions you should ask yourself before you decide to use them. Also, be sure to stick to the end because I will share with you some counsel on how you might frame a threat should you decide to issue one. So let me start though by digging in a little bit on this question of what do we mean by useful? Because in fact, threats sometimes do get us what we want. Sometimes when we threaten the other side, they back down and they say yes. But my caution here is that victories like this are often short-lived and pyrrhic. And why is this the case? Because typically if someone is agreeing under threat, they're feeling not good about you, they're not building a relationship, it's eviscerating trust. And if I'm in a business setting, if it's a colleague of mine at work, if it's a friend or a family member, I may get what I want, but there's a chance that it's going to come back to bite me. Some years ago, I had been called in to be a mediator between a big brand and a small advertising firm that was doing a bit of work for this brand. And as I dug into this mediation, one of the things that I had learned is in 2007, the big brand had used an enormous amount of leverage to really force the little advertising firm to take the worst possible deal. They were pushed almost beyond their bottom line. And the advertising firm felt they had to say yes because the big brand was one of their biggest clients. The mediation is occurring during the Great Recession. And during the Great Recession, the tables had turned and the big brand was imploding. And it desperately needed concessions, even from this advertising firm. And the advertising firm was sticking to the letter of the contract. And what became clear to me is that this would have been an entirely different story had the original negotiation been based on shared interests, criteria, trust, and relationship. But what was happening, right, is the advertising firm basically was like, he who lives by the sword dies by the sword. And so when you think about using threats, remember that it could always come home to roost at a later date. Now, to be clear, this does not mean you would never make a threat. But there are some key questions to ask yourself before you do. Number 1, is the threat yesable? So what do I mean by that? If you're threatening them, you have to at least be giving them a choice that if you were their lawyer advising them as to whether to say yes or no to what is on offer, you as the lawyer would advise them to say yes. And if you cannot say that, then this is not the moment for a threat or it's the wrong threat. Let me give you an example of a poorly conceived threat from our own history. When George W. Bush was president and negotiating with Saddam Hussein to allow weapons inspectors into Iraq to verify that Iraq did not have weapons of mass destruction, one of the things he ultimately did was say, if you do not allow these weapons inspectors in, we will actually invade you. We will actually initiate a war. So that's a threat. But what was interesting, right, is then when asked, if we do let weapons inspectors in, will you not invade? President Bush said the United States will retain all options available to it. From Saddam Hussein's perspective, why would he say yes to this? If he allows weapons inspectors in, he looks weak, he's a disappointment to his people, and guess what? There's still a chance that the Americans are going to invade. If he says no, he looks strong, he stands up to the American threat, and the threat is still there anyway. So the only way this threat would have actually worked is if the president were able to say, if you allow the weapons inspectors in, we will not invade. Now, it might not have worked, but at least it was yesable. At least if I were a lawyer advising Saddam Hussein, I would say, well, he gave you something to say yes to. So when we're going to issue a threat, we need to make sure that there's something on offer. Second, if you are considering a threat, before you do that, ask yourself this question. If you couldn't threaten them with the consequence that you are considering, what would you do next in this negotiation? Make a list of those things. And then ask yourself, have you tried those things? And if the answer is no, my suggestion to you is to try those things before moving to the threat. Because the threat is the worst way to get to yes in a negotiation. So the third question to ask yourself is, what are the costs of the threat? So specifically to these three things, how will it affect the relationship? How will it affect the trust between the parties? And how will it affect the ability of both sides to continue to work together? Because one thing that I know, right, is in most situations, whether again it's in the workplace or family or personal life or civic life, getting yes from you is only the first piece in actually a good outcome here. In addition, I need to know that our relationship is good enough, the trust is good enough, that we'll actually be able to work together. A recent example where a very prominent CEO issued a threat and had not thought through the cost to the relationship, the trust, or the ability of the parties to work together. And that involves Elon Musk and his acquisition of Twitter. Some of you may remember some months ago that he basically said to employees, you have till Thursday night to decide if you want to continue to work here, and if so, you'll have to show up in person and be prepared to work very hard. Otherwise, you should take the 3-month severance and leave. And if you may remember, an enormous number of the people took the 3-month severance and left, almost to the point where many people thought Twitter would shut down overnight. Now, it turns out that did not happen, but this was a threat poorly conceived because the threat itself was so damaging to the relationship and to trust and for the ability of parties to work together that many people just said no. And if you look at those who stayed, reports are that a disproportionate number of them stayed because they were non-American citizens, and in order to remain in the United States with valid visas, they had to continue to work at Twitter. So let's imagine that you have examined these 3 questions, and you've decided that all things being equal, I'm going to move forward with the threat. In that case, I want to give you 3 pieces of advice on how to do this successfully. First, if possible, try to frame the threat more as a reality check than as a threat. Now, this may sound a little bit like I'm splitting hairs, but there is, I think, a meaningful difference. Instead of saying something like, if you don't do this, I will, frame it slightly differently. Frame it as saying something like, one consequence of not moving forward is that I would see my own options as limited. And in that case, I might need to consider X, Y, and Z. This is not a path I'd prefer to do. And I'm curious what advice you'd have for me or thoughts you would have on how we could avoid this escalation. So I think the second phrasing will land differently and sound less like a threat, even though in some sense it is. Secondly, I want to combine my reality check with a golden bridge for them. If they say yes to my reality check, that they have somehow advanced their own interests and look like a hero to their constituency or their team. So I might say it in this way. I might say, it would be so great if we could avoid this really regrettable outcome and both deliver to our constituency. This golden bridge is critical in negotiation. This is not the moment to hold a grudge. Lastly, if I do choose to issue the threat, it needs to be credible. One of the biggest mistakes negotiators make is that they make a threat, but then they don't follow through. And the problem with that is that once you make a threat and it isn't credible, then anything you say afterwards is also lacking in credibility. So I have occasionally seen people threaten to walk out, then they do walk out, but then they come back the next day. And at this point, their credibility is shot. So from my perspective, threats are widely overused in negotiation. People think that they are much more useful than they are. Before issuing a threat, consider the answer to these 3 questions. So first, is the threat you're giving one that you would advise the other side to say yes to if you were their lawyer? 2, have you tried every other tactic before getting to the threat? And 3, have you evaluated the cost of the threat and still feel like it's worthwhile moving forward? So to continue your learning on negotiation, watch this next video, which is how do I negotiate when the other side has more power? And let me offer you a golden bridge. Please subscribe to my channel, please like this video, and don't forget to ring the bell so that you're notified whenever there's a new video here. Okay, keep on watching.